Peace and blessings, family. Today is February 3rd, 2020, and you're listening to From the Streets to the Statehouse podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, a black grassroots think tank located here in Baltimore, Maryland. We are unapologetically black in our advocacy for legislation that benefits our communities. If you would like to support this podcast and our work in Baltimore, you can go to www.lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. My name is Adam Jackson, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And the Maryland General Assembly has been in session for 27 days. Today, our Director of Public Policy, Davon Love, will be discussing a couple bills from our legislative agenda that we're currently advocating for in Annapolis. And that's including the Maryland Public Information Act, making amendments to that particular law that talks about the records of police officers and how much information gets divulged to the public. And also the second bill is called Protect Our Minors. That's the term being used to describe it in Annapolis. And it deals with requiring legal counsel when youth are questioned by law enforcement. And that's being done in partnership with Bridge, Maryland. And at the top, before we talk about those two specific bills, we're going to be talking about this concept of the black hole. It's an informal term that a lot of folks use, in a variety of contexts, but it's really being used to describe how Baltimore is oftentimes described as a quote-unquote black hole when it comes to financial resources, and how a lot of folks use that rhetoric to justify not giving Baltimore resources when it comes to things dealing with law enforcement or education or a variety of issues when it comes to financial investment in Baltimore City. So we'll be talking about those two that specific topic, but also the two bills that I just mentioned up top. And so we hope that you enjoy. It'll be a really good conversation, and that we hope you engage. Send us information. Send us a tweet if you have any information that you want to share with us about what you heard in the podcast today.
This is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy from Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This is Streets to the Statehouse podcast. So this is our second installment of a podcast that we are putting on for the purpose of giving our base and giving the general public just our general take of some of the dynamics that are a part of the work that we do in Annapolis and advocating for black people in the public policy arena. So a part of what I want to do today in this podcast is to talk about just some of the general dynamics as it relates to some of the specific policies, some of the general dynamics that impact the kinds of policies that we have been advocating for over the past several years, and some of the things that we'll be working on during this particular General Assembly. There's some general dynamics that, when we think about issues that face black people and thinking about just the environment of Annapolis, just to give some more context, and I talked about some of this in the first podcast, that Baltimore City is one jurisdiction of many around the state. And when you think about Baltimore City, you think about some of the other areas within the state that have large black populations. We actually have a fairly large legislative black caucus. We have a very high number of black elected officials in the state of Maryland. Baltimore has a very interesting reputation. And I want to start with talking about Baltimore's reputation in the Maryland General Assembly. That'll help really set the stage and set the context for the nature of the conversation that's had about the policy issues that relate to Baltimore. And I want to start with two major areas. The first is really just looking at Baltimore as a whole and how it's perceived. So when you think, one of the phrases that I've heard informally in informal circles that people outside of Baltimore use to refer to Baltimore is this idea of the black hole. That over many years, there's been a lot of exhaustion and exasperation on the part of legislators outside of Baltimore City. That this exasperation comes as a result of feeling like there's so much money put into Baltimore City. Many of the problems that exist in the state of Maryland are understood to be at their peak in Baltimore City, particularly in terms of questions of public safety, which I'll talk more in depth about later on. But this idea of a black hole, this idea that Baltimore is a city where so much money is poured into it and so much attention is poured into it, and there's just a level of exasperation, ideas that, things like mismanagement, some of the kind of political struggles that Baltimore has dealt with are the kinds of things that are the general frame that is used to approach Baltimore. And the reason why that's important, I was actually in a voting session today in the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee, and a Republican legislator was making a comment about a Baltimore City-related police bill. I don't remember exactly the bill. It's not on our list of things that we're working on. A bill that just generally gives some additional authority to Baltimore City Police, kind of authority that other police departments around the state have. And one of the comments that was made by Republican Senator Cassidy of Harford County, one of the things that he said that I thought was really interesting and that frames, I think, the larger attitude that legislators outside of Baltimore have about Baltimore is that there's so much dysfunction in Baltimore and that there's so many resources that the state invests in Baltimore. And one of the things that he literally said was that without the resources that the state of Maryland uses to subsidize the operation of many of the major institutions in Baltimore, without those investments, it would crumble. And so that outside jurisdictions have a right to essentially govern Baltimore, have a hand in how Baltimore institutions are governed. That Baltimore has abdicated its right to the level of autonomy that other jurisdictions have, given the level of investment that the state of Maryland puts into Baltimore City. And I think this comment isn't to be reduced strictly to just Senator Cassidy. I think that, and I appreciate the fact that he's honest enough to say on the record what he believes about Baltimore City or his general attitude in terms of the disposition that he has as a legislator towards Baltimore City. Because I think he speaks for many legislators, and I don't think not just for Republicans. I think there's a tendency to believe that that is an attitude that is confined just to the beliefs of Republicans. That there are lots of Democrats, lots of people who are so-called progressives who share this attitude of Baltimore being just just a conglomeration of dysfunction and just the exasperation of all the resources that are invested in Baltimore City by the state of Maryland. So I want to address this particular attitude because I think that attitude explains a lot of the legislative mechanics that have to do with the nature of the legislative advocacy in Annapolis on behalf of Baltimore. So just a few things, just in terms of pushing back against that narrative. The first is that if you're, in our base and you're folks that have listened to LBS, you're already clear. We live in a society structured on racism and white supremacy. Every arena of civil society is structured on racism and white supremacy. And when we talk about white supremacy, we're not just talking about bigotry. We're talking about an institutional arrangement that essentially advances the collective interest of white folks in all arenas of society. And so what you have is a series of institutional arrangements, both historical and contemporaneously, whether you're looking at redlining, right? So literally you have, black folks in the middle of the 20th century who would buy homes, have very stable, what the American mainstream would describe as stable, communities, neighborhoods. But because of the way in which the federal government decided that houses in black neighborhoods are valued less than white neighborhoods, you're talking about a diminished level of wealth acquisition opportunity, right? You're talking about white folks that are able to purchase homes and to use it as the basis for collateral for the development of business, to move out of Baltimore into the suburbs. So you're talking about an economic benefit that white folks had in Baltimore and just generally. And that benefit is important, and putting in context the level of wealth that white folks have to perpetuate or to develop institutions that create the opportunities that they have. Combine that with things like contract leasing, which was a practice that was very prominent in Baltimore City, where you had black families who were sold houses and they were put on a contract where if they missed one payment, then the owner of the house would take the house. And that oftentimes these contracts valued these homes at, in some cases, double or more the actual price of the home. So you had black people who were buying houses at double the amount of our white counterparts. Those are just a couple of examples of the way in which the wealth acquisition opportunities, particularly in the middle of the 20th century, created an environment where white folks just have more access to more resources, which creates more access to opportunity. And then particularly if you look at it in the context of education, many people have heard of the phenomena of white flight, where you had white folks that fled from the cities. And it's important to note that was a process that was heavily racialized. It wasn't just a matter of white folks decided they wanted to live in the suburbs, and that the suburbs were a very expensive creation. When you think about all the extra amenities that are required to sustain an additional community, that you need a fire department, you need a police department, you need roads, you need hospitals, you need schools, you need all these additional amenities in order to sustain the lifestyle of those in the suburbs. And so along with the phenomena of white flight, and just a really quick anecdote, there's a gentleman named Howell Baum who wrote a book called Brown in Baltimore. And in the book, he actually talks about some of the reasons that white families did not want their children to go to schools with black people. And most of the letters, so he looked at a lot of the letters that were sent to the school board, and many of the letters that were sent to the school board as to why they rejected forced integration, the rationale was around not wanting their white daughters in close proximity to black boys. So you think about just the collective American racist imagination about black people. As we talk about public safety, black men in particular, those notions played a role in why there was an increase after Brown versus Board of Education, and after you see school integration get underway, you actually see concurrent with that the emergence of private schools, right? And white folks pulling their children out of public school, creating these these private schools, for the purposes of not being around black people. So you have that, you have white flight, so you have all these things that contribute to Baltimore being in the condition that it's in currently. Add on top of that, one of the things that LBS has criticized for many years now is the nonprofit industrial complex, but more broadly the human social service sector in general. We actually released a black paper back in October that talks about our criticism of the human social service sector here in Baltimore. And so one of the things that has happened is that what happens after the integration becomes the major policy thrust to address racial issues. And this is actually something that was pretty well documented in Howard McDougall's book, Black Baltimore. He describes that before integration, the institutions that are responsible for socializing black youth and the black family in general were institutions and organizations owned, controlled, and operated by the black community. Many of them grassroots organizations, many of them institutions that were immersed in the history and culture of people of African descent. After integration is underway, the institutions that were responsible for socializing black youth and black family became white-led, corporate, in many cases, big box nonprofit organizations, for whom many of them, their frame of reference of black people was from a basis in pathology, that they would study all the things that are wrong with black people. And you have people who make careers off of basically studying and being experts on black pathology. So an institution that I think has hugely benefit from this is Johns Hopkins, whether it's the School of Public Health or the School of Education. Right, they have, some of my mentors and the folks who are in the tradition of the black radical tradition that I come out of, describe jokingly people in that industry as Negroologists, right? People who just spend their time studying black people, but they themselves don't have a track record of improving the quality of life of black people. So you got folks who make, lots of money, their livelihood off of black suffering, off of being folks who run organizations that are supposed to serve our community, who aren't accountable to our community. And so what you have is billions of dollars that have been invested in those kinds of institutions. See, what happens is a lot of people, when they describe Baltimore as a black hole, what they think is we're giving all, and what they won't say, but what they really mean is we're giving all this money to black people and they keep squandering the money. But when you actually look at where the money goes, most of that money does not end up into the hands of black people. Most of those resources end up in the hands of either government bureaucrats who are controlled by the government sector, who give out contracts to people that, again, aren't immersed in our history and culture, right? And I'll talk specifically about institutions. We can talk about organizations like Teach for America, right, which is an institution that is not immersed in the history and culture of people of African descent. And that's an institution that produces many of the education professionals that exist here in Baltimore City. And so when you think about where the money is going, and this is really my message, both to legislators and advocates, when this whole black hole notion comes up, is what we have to ask ourselves is, where is the money actually going? The money, most of the money is not going to the hands of black people. And oftentimes what happens is that's the representation. That's the frame that is used to describe Baltimore, is that you give these Negroes money and they squander it. There was actually an interesting story years back when Andreas Alonzo was the school CEO. And Fox 45 actually did a story on a PTA meeting. So they were looking at waste of the school district. And they did a story of a PTA meeting where they bought fried chicken. And the story was about them spending $300 on fried chicken as waste. And rightly, Dr. Alonzo called out the reporter and the network for saying that you're talking about, a minuscule percentage of the dollars that report had found to be waste of the Baltimore City schools district, and you're leading with a story about a PTA meeting of black people buying fried chicken. So I use that example not to really relitigate that specific example, but just to show the media representations that are used to describe monies that is given to Baltimore City as black people squandering money. And when you think about the leadership, philanthropy has a big role in Baltimore in terms of what institutions get access to resources, the kinds of programming that gets funded and supported. We actually recently, well, not recently, but about a year ago, and this actually included in the black paper I mentioned, a criticism of Thread, which is a big nonprofit organization, white-led organization that gets millions of dollars, right? And those are the kinds of institutions where the people who are either in those networks, the folks who are leaders in the philanthropic sector, that's where the resources are going. In addition to, so we have that. And then kind of the last thing on this black hole piece, in addition to that, we have a city where $500 million spent on law enforcement. So $500 million spent on law enforcement, that's a lot of money and resources that could be going to other things. And so as a result of the crisis that people that we're experiencing in terms of the issues of violence and homicide, a part of what is happening is that is used as a rationale for more investment in law enforcement. And so, again, I'll talk more about that particular dynamic later. But I just want to kind of put a bow on this point that this notion of Baltimore as a black hole is something, and just the exasperation of legislators outside of Baltimore and dealing with issues that face Baltimore, that there is a lack of understanding of the way in which white supremacy impacts both the inequities that then produce the need for increase or higher levels of state investment, but also the frame doesn't deal with the fact that there is a institutional arrangement in Baltimore City in terms of where those dollars go, where it doesn't actually get to the community. And it's not black people who are at the top who are squandering it for the most part. You have some of that. But for the most part, you have institutions that have a parasitic relationship to our community that are able to drive the nature where resources go that don't actually hit the ground. And so that's the way that we need to push back against legislators that demonstrate this level of exasperation. But I think also it's incumbent on us in Baltimore City to also think about how do we restructure institutions in this city in such a way that it allows us to receive money that goes to the ground, like to receive resources that actually gets to the communities that it needs to get to, or else we'll continue to be dumping money into an institutional arrangement that is more about advancing the professional careers of people whose livelihood is based on Black suffering, as opposed to investing in building an independent Black infrastructure that will have a way of actually dealing with these issues. Many of the solutions and the institutions that are said to be helpful to Black people, many times the relationship is one of a dependent relationship. And so there needs to be a really intentional investment, a very intentional investment in building the kind of institutional arrangements that can actually empower Black people on the ground. So that's the piece about this black hole. And again, it's really important. You'll hear conversation. I'm going to come back to this black hole concept in a couple of podcasts from now when we talk about some of the movement legislatively on education. And we're at the end of January, so there isn't a whole lot of movement on many legislative items. You'll see a lot more committee hearings on bills in February and March. And so there we'll have a whole lot to say about some of the other legislative efforts that we're working on. So just wanted to kind of foreground that. The second kind of major thing that also connects. So there's also a very heightened level of interest, awareness, conversation about the issues of public safety in Baltimore City. And that's something that also impacts it. It feeds off of it. It amplifies the kind of black hole mentality that I mentioned earlier. Because the issue of public safety for many people around the state, it represents a just lack of competence. It represents just a lack of stability and leadership. But it also represents the notion of black pathology that is projected onto black people. And so I want to talk a little bit about the way in which notions of black pathology are present in conversations about public safety. So I'm actually working on a piece that I mentioned in the last podcast that connects public safety, violence, and white supremacy. And so there are a couple of things that I want to point out that I think are important in having that conversation. The actual quote that I'm going to use that begins the piece is from Amos Wilson, a black psychologist and scholar. And he says that the phenomena of homicide and violence is an externalization of a suicidal impulse. And so what Amos Wilson is describing there is the way in which notions of black people's humanity being questioned, whether it's in popular culture, whether it's in the education system, whether it's what you see around you, that those things impact people in ways that then create the lack of value necessary to take the life of someone that looks like you. And so that's a part of what Dr. Wilson is describing about black men and the phenomena of homicide. But what I want to do is also talk about some of the ways in which the pathologization of black people is something that I think is not valued enough in terms of its impact on the collective American consciousness and psyche. So what I want to do, so there are a few clips that I use, a few quotes, excerpts that I use to kind of make this point about just the pervasiveness of black pathology. So I just want to give two examples that I think are important relevant to this conversation. So the first that I use is Harriet Washington. She wrote a book called Medical Apartheid. And she writes about the term crack baby and how it showed up in popular culture. So I'm just going to read the excerpt that I used and then explain why I used it. So Harriet Washington says, in September 1985, the New England Journal of Medicine published research by Dr. Ira Chasnoff, an associate professor of pediatrics and psychiatry at the University of Illinois, that described his findings that babies born to cocaine-using mothers remained smaller, sicker, moodier, and less social than other infants. His investigation, however, was tentative and profoundly flawed. It had no control group, and he had studied the children of merely 23 women, far too few to infer anything about prenatal cocaine exposure in general. The punitive harms done to crack babies were first popularized in graphic detail in 1989 by Washington Post columnist Charles Krauthammer, who warned, quote, "The inner city crack epidemic is now giving birth to the newest horror, a bio underclass, a generation of physically damaged crack babies who biological inferiority is stamped at birth. Douglas Birshoff of the American Enterprise Institute, who coined the phrase bio underclass, did not shy away from the racial label. Quote, "This is no stuff that Head Start can fix. This is permanent brain damage. Whether it is 5% or 15% of the black community, it is there." Krauthammer's column triggered a cascade of national headlines describing these infants as born addicted to crack and neurologically damaged to the point where they constituted a permanent army of inferiority, miniature ghouls who could never be human. USA Today bewailed, quote, "Crack babies born to life of suffering," end quote. In its piece, "Crack Toll Among Babies, a Joyless View Even of Toys," the New York Times detailed how maternity wards around the country ring with the high-pitched cat cries of neurologically impaired crack babies. None of this had been demonstrated by research, and none of this was true. Although exposure to cocaine in the uterus can damage a fetus, a baby cannot be born addicted to cocaine, as children are sometimes born addicted to other narcotic drugs. Neither is there any difference between prenatal exposure to cocaine and crack cocaine. Moreover, the diagnosis of crack baby is based upon a woman's positive drug test, not upon the baby's clinical picture. So it makes no distinction between mothers who smoke crack habitually and those who did so rarely. There is no such medical entity as a crack baby. So the reason why that's important is because the notion crack baby was a pop culture term that was used during the height of the war on drugs for the purpose of justifying the process, the phenomenon of mass incarceration. This notion of crack baby was something that was so pervasive. I remember reading this 10 years ago, and it was astonishing to me, that last line, that there's no such medical entity as a crack baby, right? So the fact that a term that has no basis in medicine but was so popularized is an example of the way in which notions of black pathology is baked into the collective American consciousness. So it's important for us to understand that that just doesn't go away. That's not something that, that just leads the collective American consciousness. And in fact, I think a part of the next thing that I want to quote, it comes from a study called The Essence of Innocence. It was a study done in 2014, Philip Goff and a team of researchers. They did a study on attitudes about boys of various different racial categories. And in the research, some of the key findings in this study, again, the study is called The Essence of Innocence. There are a few things that it concludes. The first is that they conclude that black males aged 14 to 17 are understood to be as culpable for their actions as non-black males aged 18 to 21. So on average, black males are aged at about 5 to 6 years older than their actual age. What it also means is that when someone is aged as older than they actually are, there's a level of willingness to do really extreme forms of punishment to that person when they're understood to be more culpable for their behavior. So again, this is a study that showed that even though the age, if you take men, younger black boys, that they were understood to be as culpable for their behavior as adult white men. And so that helps explain the nature of why there was so much willingness to engage in the war on drugs and mass incarceration. The other conclusion it also comes to, and I mentioned, so black males are understood to essentially be less innocent than black males. One of the most stunning findings was that participants who were primed with dehumanizing associations, so they would, folks that associated black people to like apes, were the kinds of dehumanizing associations they're talking about. Participants who were primed with dehumanizing associations showed a reduced belief in the essential distinction between black children and black adults. So what that means is that, particularly in policing context, that you have the loss of protections that you get as a child, the loss of really a recognition of your humanity. And so the reason that those dehumanizing associations are important is because the basis of those dehumanized associations come from the stuff that I mentioned earlier that come from the medical apartheid excerpt that describes the way in which popular culture flooded society with notions like crack baby for the basis of creating this pathologized notion of black people, to make black people to be understood as inherently violent, having inherent predisposition to violence. I said I do too. I'll do one more that I think is actually really, really helpful and really useful. An excerpt that I use, and this is from Sylvia Winter in a piece that she wrote in '94 called "No Humans Involved." So she's a professor and she's writing to her colleagues. And what she says is that, this is the intro to her letter. She says, "You may have heard a radio news report which aired briefly during the days after the jury's acquittal of the policeman in the Rodney King beating case. The report stated that public officials of the judicial system of Los Angeles routinely use the acronym NHI to refer to any case involving a breach of the rights of young black males who belong to the jobless category of inner city ghettos. NHI means no humans involved." So the phrase that was used to describe young black males when there was an incident involving black males was no humans involved. So I think that framework, really helps us to understand the importance of the way in which white supremacy, the notion of white supremacy, impacts the consciousness of Americans. And so when we think about legislators around the state, they have been saturated in these anti-black notions that emerge out of the system of white supremacy that impact then how they interact or how they come to understand notions of public safety. So going back to the Amos Wilson quote, to me is one of the most poignant explanations for the phenomena of homicide, right? When you, in addition to, and so I want to also acknowledge that there's also an economic element to homicide as well. In fact, there's a report by the Office of the Public Defender where they actually listed the 9 most common felony convictions in the state of Maryland. And 8 of the 9 of the most frequent convictions, felony convictions in the state of Maryland, have to do with taking someone's money or property. So you're talking about burglary, talking about robbery, talking about theft, right? So those were the most common convictions, felony convictions, which substantiates the fact that there's an economic element to it as well. But in addition to the economic element, there is, as Amos Wilson describes, when you don't value yourself, it's easy to kill someone that looks like you. And so when you think about the images that are projected onto black people, the same images that black folks internalize that help make it easy to take the life of another black man are the same images that policymakers around the state of Maryland have internalized that cause them to have made the kinds of policies that do harm to black people, that perpetuate mass incarceration. So when we talk about the issue of public safety in Baltimore, we have to talk about, what are the ways that we can deal with the issue of public safety in a way that gets around these projections and gets around these notions of pathology. And one of the things that often gets framed out of the conversation is the conversation about the extreme deficiencies of law enforcement. See, one of the impacts of the notion of white supremacy is not only does it make people see black folks as inherently prone to violence and make people think that we need to be fixed, but what it also does is that it creates an environment where those who are tasked with dealing with the so-called pathology are put in a category where they are almost blameless and faultless. And in this context, we're talking about the police department. So I remember many years ago, when I began working on police reform, legislative advocacy, and I would talk about, and myself and others would talk about the extent to which law enforcement was engaged in corruption. We would talk about stories of police officers robbing people and selling drugs and using excessive force. And I remember, I'm talking 2015, 2016, 2014, 2015, 2016. I remember many of the attitudes I would get in response is as if I was talking in conspiracy theory, right? As if I was just I hate police or was anti-police and was creating these caricatures in order to get people to have negative beliefs about the police. And so what's fascinating is, since the exposures of the Gun Trace Task Force, now you have elected officials, you have legislators who now are in many ways are forced to eat their words, right? Because they expose the level of corruption that many people have been talking about for years. So here's what's important about the extreme deficiencies in law enforcement. No matter, what play you call, no matter what plan you come up with, if your law enforcement entity is extremely compromised, then it is not reasonable to believe that law enforcement can do the job that most people would agree is their job, which is to put people behind bars that are the ones that are the drivers of violence and homicide. And so when you have law enforcement that is either corrupt or extremely incompetent, and a part of what happens is all those years that myself and people before me, all these years where people were trying to raise issues about the nature of how corrupt the police department was. I mean, one of the people who in the state of Maryland that's really responsible for really propelling this conversation before it was popular, the State Senator Joe Carter, who was then Delegate Joe Carter. When the O'Malley administration between 1999 and 2007, there were 757,000 illegal arrests during that time. In 2006, the ACLU-NAACP sued the city of Baltimore and won because they had 100,000 arrests in 1 year. So when you think about the years of people talking about the level of corruption and incompetence that exists within the police department, how could one expect any plan that you put in place to be effective on issues of public safety if you don't address the police department? And so a lot of times when we've talked about police reform, we've talked about it in the context of dealing with police misconduct. But we also want people to put our efforts on police reform in the box of public safety. Because if the public is able to get information, is able to have transparent information about the nature of law enforcement, it puts us in a position to pressure policymakers to make the kind of changes, to make law enforcement accountable, to get rid of police officers that are either incompetent or engaged in corruption. But the public has to be a partner in that. When you think about an industry like law enforcement that's been as insular as it has been, it requires the public, and it requires mechanisms the public can use to exert force to be able to discipline law enforcement, to be able to help make decisions that can address the issue of police corruption within the police department. There's no way to do it without the public in a way that'll satisfy many of these concerns and issues. And in fact, it's the culture of insularity that has precipitated such deficiencies within law enforcement. So if we're talking about homicide, and we're talking about public safety, and you want to get the people behind bars who are the drivers of homicide and violence. If that is the issue that we're trying to address, then what is necessary is that we need to deal with the deficiency of law enforcement, and to have greater transparency and accountability, so that the public can be a part of the process of making sure that police officers aren't covering for each other, that police are actually doing their job and expected to do their job, and that they're able to have the resources necessary to be able to do it. Otherwise, we're going to, and that's a part of the issue that we've had in previous sessions where folks talked about mandatory minimums and sentence enhancements. And we made it very clear that those things don't work. One of the things that, to Commissioner Harrison's credit, one of the things that he stated publicly is that, and he said it today at the briefing, there was a joint briefing with the House Judiciary and Senate Judiciary Committees. And one of the things that he said, that he said before, it is not the severity of a penalty that is the deterrent to violent crime. It is the certainty that you're going to get caught. So if a person engages in violent criminal behavior, but they know they're not going to get caught, it doesn't matter what the length of the penalty is. And that has to do with the competency and quality of law enforcement. That's not about the length of the sentence. It's not about judges letting people off easy. It's about just the sheer incompetence of law enforcement to get prosecutors the information they need to be able to get people off the streets that need to be off the streets. And so if we're not looking at law enforcement as a major problem, which I think is part of the problem, has been the major problem in popular discourses about public safety. We keep saying, what's the crime plan? We keep saying, what do we need to do to help police? What we need to be asking, the question we need to be asked is, how do we make sure that we get the transparency we need to hold police accountable, to root out officers that are incompetent, and to make sure that they're not contributing to the issue of violence and homicide. So on that note, some of the things that we're working on that will be relevant to this conversation. I mentioned before the Maryland Public Information Act. So we're partnering with the ACLU of Maryland, and we're working on a piece of legislation that would so under current law, investigatory records and personnel records of law enforcement are prohibited from public view. And so what we're working to do is to change that so that those records, if requested, can be gotten, and really for the purpose of being able to know the extent to which officers are disciplined for behavior that is detrimental to the public. So, and that'll be a really valuable tool, because that's a tool that the community can use to point out patterns of behavior in law enforcement. That'll make, because, and I mean, the other thing that's important to note is that if you're in a job and you know that no one's ever going to look, then you're going to engage in all kinds of behavior because no one's going to look. What this will do is it'll create the expectation for law enforcement that whatever you do, people are going to see it. And because people see it, people are going to be forced to act on it. And so it just provides the leverage for the community to be able to have some influence over how the institution of law enforcement is operated. So that's that piece. The other piece that we're working on, we're partnering with Bridge Maryland. Again, this is another thing I mentioned before, about a bill that will require legal counsel be present when young people are being interrogated by police. So if you've seen When They See Us, this was kind of one of those major things that was in that. And so there was actually an event this past week. So it was on Saturday. So I was in Harford County at a church on Saturday morning with Bridge Maryland and some of their partners to discuss this bill. And there were some stories. I was actually on stage with two gentlemen who spent upwards of 15 to 20 years behind bars for things they didn't do. They were children when they got picked up and spent, most of their life behind bars. And it had to do with police officers interrogating young people, getting them to say things that they probably shouldn't have said, that were then used to put together a case to put them behind bars. And so this is one of those pieces of legislation that the importance of it is to make sure that there's legal counsel present, so that families have the proper information they need to engage law enforcement in that way. So those are the kind of law enforcement, public safety related things that we're working on. We're working on other pieces of legislation. Like I said in the beginning, there isn't a whole lot of movement right now. We're in January, so we're still kind of in the beginning of session. The deadlines for bill drafting are coming this coming week, and so you still have legislators putting in bills. So that, there haven't really been that many hearings on very many bills. February and March are going to be the months where there are a whole lot more hearings. So you'll be hearing in the feature podcast and some of our action alerts, you'll be hearing kind of more specific movement on some of our other bills, which include piece around cultural responsive pedagogy and race equity in education. So that's an issue that we're working on. That bill was a bill that was going to be sponsored by the delegation chair, Delegate Stephanie Smith. We're actually going to make that an amendment onto the Major Kerwin bill, so that it's not a separate bill. So it's going to be really important that is in the bill. It was in the original Kerwin Commission recommendations. For those who aren't familiar, the Kerwin Commission was a commission established a few years ago to do a comprehensive reform of education in the state of Maryland. And so this is a major piece of legislation that'll shift funding for education. But we want to make sure that there is cultural responsive pedagogy and race equity baked into every aspect of how professionals are trained. Many of the mainstream institutions that are in education, public health, social work are going in the direction of racial equity. And it's in fact become a buzzword, it's become obnoxious the way that people use race equity without being oriented or trained in a rigorous way around how to operationalize it. So we want to require it so that's a part of how folks are trained. It becomes a kind of a requirement for people who are going to interact with folks in our community. So we're going to work on that. We're working on marijuana legalization, which includes, so it's not going to pass this session. There was a plan, about a year and a half ago by the presiding officers that something would come out in 2020. That's not going to happen. It's probably going to happen in 2021. But there's still some things happening where there will be testimony on marijuana legalization. Of course, LBS's role in that is particularly about how those revenues are spent, the tax revenues are spent, that those dollars should go to the communities most impacted by the war on drugs. So that's really our particular framework for looking at it, in addition to looking at some of the business side. The business side is big and it's complicated. We're really going to focus on things like micro business, so Black folks having access to some of the auxiliary industries that are part of the marijuana business, given the fact that, particularly in Maryland, to own a dispensary is tremendously capital intensive. And so we'll look at what does it mean to, tax some of those big dispensaries to make sure that those revenues, because that's off the backs of Black folks. And so to make sure that those resources are going into the communities most impacted by the war on drugs and providing some business opportunity for Black folks. We also are working on a bill that would create a fund that would direct the money that is taxed on medical marijuana to a fund that would specifically help for Black, minority and small women-owned businesses, with the intention that those dollars are tracked primarily to Black folks, as Black folks, again, are the ones that have been, who've suffered as a result of the prohibition on cannabis that has animated the war on drugs. So those are some of the other pieces of legislation that we're working on, and we're partnering on other pieces of legislation as well that you'll hear about as we go throughout session. I want to highlight a couple of efforts that some of our partners are working on that I think are particularly important and relevant. One is the Job Opportunities Task Force that we partner with on a variety of different legislative efforts is working on the repeal of the unit rule. So for those who aren't familiar, the unit rule is essentially a situation where if you get charged, so you get picked up, you get charged. Most people, when you get picked up, you get charged with a unit of charges, right? So you might, you get into a bad fight, someone gets hurt real bad. You might get charged with first degree murder, or attempted murder, second degree assault, first degree assault. Maybe you had a bag of weed on you, so you get charged with possession. You might get charged with possession when intended to distribute. So you get all these charges. And what happens is if you only get convicted of one, let's say you plead down to second degree assault. So you plead down. What happens is that all those charges, because they're in a unit, remain on your record. You can't get the stuff expunged that you didn't get convicted of. And the reason why the unit rule is so important is because most folks that get charged with a unit of charges. So you have all this legislation. You saw like ban the box. You see a bunch of expungement stuff. But what good is getting stuff expunged if for many people it's in a unit of charges? And so you get one of those charges expunged, but you can't get expunged that whole unit of charges. So that attempted murder charge that you just got charged with, because that's part of the problem with the criminal justice system is prosecutors will overcharge because they're trying to get a conviction. And so you got that attempted murder charge, but you actually pled to second degree assault. And so now that's on your record in perpetuity. And this is something that's been, a battle for many years in the legislature to get this passed. But the unit rule is really the essential aspect of criminal justice reform here in the state of Maryland. Again, because a lot of people who get charged with a unit of charges. So again, be on the lookout for the unit rule. Delegate Eric Barron out of Prince George's County is the lead on that. And so I think it'll be important for people to look out for that. And then the other legislative effort that we're supportive of, there was actually a press conference earlier this week about the need for a women's pre-release unit. So our partners at Out for Justice have been working on having a women's pre-release unit in the state of Maryland. Apparently there is no brick and mortar, according to Nicole Hansen, who's the executive director of Out for Justice. What she said at the press conference is there is no freestanding brick and mortar pre-release unit for women. They have a bunch of these for men, but they don't have one independent, freestanding, brick and mortar pre-release for women. And so this is really important because when folks are exiting out of incarceration, it's important for them to have that in-between step, helping them get the things necessary to effectively transition back into general society. And so this is something that has been legislatively in the works for many years now. And so I was there at the press conference and spoke, and it's an effort that we support. One of the things that I said in my remarks is that, when you look at the data around the criminal justice system, most of the conversation is about the way that it's impacted black men, and I think rightly so. But that also means that it's important to note that black women are the fastest rising demographic of those being sucked into the criminal justice system. And so with that being said, it's important that there are services for women that are sucked into the criminal justice system so that they're able to effectively re-enter society. And so that's something that, just as a matter of basic principle, as an organization that supports efforts that impact black people acutely, that's an effort that, is important in the kind of criminal justice realm. So those are many of the issues that I wanted to give you all an update on. Like I said, there are other legislative efforts that I mentioned in the first podcast that I didn't talk about a lot today because, we're still early on in session. In the next podcast, there's going to be more conversation about some of our other legislative priorities that I haven't talked about as of yet, as hearing dates come up. Also, we're going to be doing a lobby day in March, so be on the lookout for a lobby day where we want people to come down to Annapolis to talk to your legislators. One of the most important things about the work that we do legislatively is that your voice is what allows us to have the leverage to be able to do the things that we need to do. And you'd be amazed at what 10, 20 phone calls will do in terms of getting something passed in the Maryland General Assembly. So as always, your support is necessary for our work to happen. We're not an organization that's sponsored by any corporate entity. We're an organization that's grassroots, and all of our juice, all of our power comes from the fact that we have a base of people that care about the issues that we present. We have a base of people that, recognize and support and value the independent black advocacy that we engage in. And it's become a part of what people expect down in the Maryland General Assembly. And so with your support, it is your support that helps us be able to push on these kinds of issues and to really have these kind of conversations. I mean, even at the top, when I talked about this notion of the black hole, this is something that people have talked about in private conversations for many years. But I haven't really seen much public conversation about this notion and it being, confronted head on. So I'm actually really hopeful about the way in which this whole black hole conversation will play out and conversations that people have after you watch this. But again, that's only possible because we're an organization that has a base. We're independent and black and advocate unapologetically for black people. So I'll leave it there. Again, I'm Davon Love, Director of Public Policy of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This is Streets to the Statehouse podcast. Again, we appreciate your support. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to From the Streets to the Statehouse podcast. I'm Adam Jackson, the Chief Executive Officer for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. You've been listening to Davon Love, the Director of Public Policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This podcast was produced and edited by Theo Atlas. You can listen to From the Streets to the Statehouse podcast on all major platforms for podcast streaming, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. If you want to learn about Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, you can go to lbsbaltimore.com. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at LBS Baltimore. Thank you. See you next time. Peace.